last I checked, NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And unless tectonic plates move very fast recently, China is nowhere near the North Atlantic. And it's also bizarre because NATO is a military alliance focused on protecting Europe. So its only topic should be security in Europe. And China isn't by any stretch of the imagination a security threat to Europe. It's a serious economic competitor for sure, but there is just about zero chance that Chinese tanks will ever make their way towards Europe.
Hello everyone, I'm Rania Khalek and this is Dispatches. As the war in Ukraine continues to escalate, you would think that one conflict between nuclear-armed powers that could snowball into a World War III apocalypse would be enough for our leaders. But that hasn't stopped the US from continuing its provocations against China. Most assume, because of the war in Ukraine, that NATO is still all about countering Russia. But the US is trying to reshape NATO into an anti-China alliance, while demanding that the EU join in the campaign to isolate China. So far, the US has been somewhat immunized from the consequences of cutting economic ties with Russia. For the EU, the outcome of sanctions has been much more dire as winter approaches and officials prepare for energy rationing. A decoupling from China would be even more devastating to Europeans. China has, in the last 20 years, surpassed the US to become the EU's largest trading partner. Is the EU really willing to commit economic suicide for the US, as it's already doing with its Ukraine policy? Here to discuss this and more is Arnaud Bertrand, a commentator on economics and geopolitics based in Shanghai. But before we jump into it, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can help it grow by becoming a patron at patreon.com/breakthroughnews or by donating below on YouTube. Arnaud, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me again. Nice to see you.
Well, it's nice to see you as well. It's such a pleasure. You're coming to me this time, of course, from France,
Yes.
which is good because we're actually going to be talking quite a bit about Europe and the EU. But before we get into some of the other topics, I wanted to ask you, since this just happened in the news, we had this meeting between Presidents Biden and Xi ahead or maybe on the side of the G20. And it seems that they both came to some sort of agreement, at least in rhetoric, that they don't want a new Cold War, which is certainly a good thing. Though, of course, the policies of the US remain the same as far as I can see. And it was their first face-to-face encounter since Biden took office. So I guess let's start there. What are your thoughts on that meeting? Is there anything in particular we should take away from it? Was it significant?
Good question. I mean, I think it was the first time that Biden met Xi in person after he became president. So it's quite crazy when you think about it. The first meeting when he's been president for 2 or 3 years now.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've read through both the Chinese and the American readout from the meeting. The American one is very short, basically restating what their position on China has been since the beginning of the Biden administration. So there was nothing big from that. The Chinese one is a bit more detailed. What I found particularly interesting is that it was repeated several times that the American words should match American actions, should match their words. So Biden probably got an earful from Xi on that topic because I think they spoke several times on the phone on Taiwan, for instance, where Biden, I guess, repeated that their one China policy hadn't changed, and then in the directions were quite a bit different. For instance, with Pelosi's visit on backing off from so-called strategic ambiguity on all of this. So I don't know. Hopefully, right after the meeting, Biden said that they didn't think a Chinese attack on Taiwan was imminent. I think those were his exact words. When just 2 or 3 weeks previously, Blinken, his Secretary of State, had said basically the contrary, that he thought China was preparing to attack Taiwan soon. So this is a little bit of a change of tone. Is it because of what she said that they should calm down on Taiwan and make sure that their actions match their words? I don't know. Hopefully, my hope is that this brings down the tensions between both countries and that this caused the bottom in the hostilities between both. But like you said, I don't think that U.S. actions are going to particularly change. In their readout, they said that they will remain. They will continue to compete with China very aggressively, that they will continue to try and rally other countries to their cause. So, yeah, it's not back to, the relationship is not back to where it was before Trump, basically.
Right. And then, of course, to, I guess, build off of that, I mean, some have argued that the U.S. approach to China makes war more likely. And that's a position that you've expressed agreement with. So I'm curious if you could elaborate on that a bit. Why do you think that U.S. policy towards China at the moment makes war more likely?
So there is this very interesting concept of internal relations called the security dilemma. I don't know if you've heard about it. So it's basically when a state takes actions to make itself more secure, but which are then viewed by other states as threatening. So they take actions on their own, and this all leads to a spiral of hostility that in the end makes everyone less secure. So the US, as we all know, has a very broad definition of what its security and interests are. It's not just confined to the territory of the US, but it expands worldwide, really. And in particular, it's of the view that Taiwan is very much part of its interest, and that if China ever reunifies with Taiwan, it will be a catastrophic breach of their security interests. China, of course, has a very different view on Taiwan, to say the least. So for China, Taiwan is a non-negotiable part of China. It's very, very symbolic to them for 2 reasons, really. The first one is because it was colonized by Japan during the Century of Humiliation, and then given back to China at the end of World War II. It symbolizes national shame, that colonization, the Century of Humiliation, and so on. Even on the scale of China's long, millennia-old history, truly stands out. On the second reason why Taiwan is so important is because it represents the unfinished civil war that occurred right after World War II. The Communist Party won the civil war, and their opponents, the KMT, took refuge in Taiwan, which by then was already back as part of China's territory, since the communist victory in the civil war was in 1949, and China got Taiwan back from Japan in 1945. Chiang Kai-shek was, of course, assisted by the Americans, who essentially helped him hold out in Taiwan against the communists. And that situation lasts to this day. So it represents an unfinished civil war that couldn't be ended because of foreign interference. And again, for the Chinese psyche, foreign interference, meaning being weak versus foreigners on your own territory, is undoubtedly the most unacceptable and most shameful front, basically. So to come back to my security dilemma point, there was, during exactly 50 years, since 1972, an agreement between China and the US, struck by Kissinger and Nixon on the US side, that essentially froze the situation for 5 decades. It's the so-called 3 joint communiques that essentially says that Taiwan is part of China, but that they agree to disagree on what China means. So for China, China is the People's Republic of China, but for Taiwan, China means the Republic of China, basically a China managed by Taiwan's government, not Beijing's. And more importantly, with these communiques, the US agreed to abandon a two-China solution to the problem and to not support any Taiwanese aspirations of independence. And this understanding between China and the US worked very well for all involved. There was peace during 5 decades, and both China and Taiwan developed tremendously, as we know. But what the Biden administration has done is largely come back on these agreements. So, for instance, Biden stated 4 times that the US commits to defend Taiwan in case of war, thereby abandoning its long-term policy of strategic ambiguity, which was to remain vague and non-committal on the matter. And concretely, what this does is to encourage Taiwan to move towards an independence, because if the strongest military in the world commits to have your back if you become independent, that's quite an encouragement, right?
Right.
Also, there was a lot of rhetoric on the American side that encouraged independentists in Taiwan. So Biden went as far as saying that independence is up to Taiwan, when historically the US has always said that they don't support Taiwanese independence, which was the agreement it had in 1972 with China. So with this and plenty of other small or big provocations like Pelosi's visit back in August, we have a progressive destruction of the agreement between China and the US that maintained peace during 50 years. So yeah, we have a case where the US took actions that it might have believed made it more secure, like the commitment to defend Taiwan, but in fact that threw a lot of instability into the matter. It really heightened tension. And that was perceived, quite understandably by China as threatening, and it encouraged a very, very dangerous spiral. And the solution to all that is obvious, because it has worked for 50 years. The US needs to abide by the letter and the spirit of the agreement struck by Kissinger and Nixon 50 years ago, and moving the goalposts can only make things worse, basically.
Most assume that because of the war in Ukraine, that NATO is still all about countering Russia, which of course it very much is. I mean, that's its entire existence is about being a military alliance against Russia. But we do see more and more that the US is trying to reshape NATO into this anti-China military alliance as well. Why do you think that is?
So far, what we have on China from NATO is a statement that says, quote, China challenges our interests, security, and values, end quote, and various declarations by Stoltenberg. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, the head of NATO, that it's important for NATO to stand together and address the consequences of the rise of China, and statements to that effect. Which, as you point out, is rather bizarre, because last I checked, NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And unless tectonic plates move very fast recently, China is nowhere near the North Atlantic. And it's also bizarre because NATO is a military alliance focused on protecting Europe. So its only topic should be security in Europe. And China isn't by any stretch of the imagination a security threat to Europe. It's a serious economic competitor for sure, but there is just about zero chance that Chinese tanks will ever make their way towards Europe like Russian tanks eventually could. So it's very strange that NATO gets into topics that have nothing to do with what it's meant to be about, really. So what I suspect is that the US tried very hard to put together a NATO-like coalition in Asia and failed. There is zero country in Asia, save for the 2 countries the US still, basically occupies, which is Japan and South Korea, that have a desire to join an anti-China military alliance. Actually, I don't even think that Japan and South Korea want to join an anti-China military alliance, because so far the only one that's been created is AUKUS, and it only includes Anglo-Saxon countries, Anglo countries, because it's the US, the UK, and Australia. There is also the Quad, but the Quad is basically an association of 4 countries: Australia, Japan, India, and the US, without a clear purpose, since you have India consistently saying it's not a military alliance, and they work on very diverse stuff like COVID or climate. So basically what I think is that NATO being somewhat repurposed to also go after China is in many ways an admission of failure by the US to gather a coalition in Asia. Instead, it has to go all the way to the other side of the world and try to co-opt countries, which anyway are already in its sphere of influence, to join its anti-China crusade.
Right. And then, of course, there's the issue of how significant this would actually be for the EU, right? Because, we know that China in the last 20 years has surpassed the United States to become the EU's largest trading partner. And then for the last 6 years, it's been Germany's biggest trading partner. So I guess the question becomes, I kind of just gave the answer, but why would a shift of NATO becoming an anti-China military alliance and a shift towards isolating China on top of Russia, why would this be so significant for the EU? And why would the EU go about committing economic suicide for the US? I mean, it's already doing that with Ukraine to some degree. But like I just mentioned, with the fact that China's their biggest trading partner, that would be even more devastating for Europe if it actually joins in this sort of US campaign to isolate China.
Yeah. I mean, the danger for the EU is that it could tie its hands when it comes to acting on China, for instance, on sanctions or providing military support should there be a war in Taiwan, and so on and so forth. So it's significant because once more it restrains European independence from the US when it comes to choices that should be sovereign and independent. It's an instrument of control, really. Let me read to you the words of de Gaulle, our last good president on NATO. As a reminder, he famously pulled out of NATO for this very reason, because he saw it as an instrument of American control. And his words, even today, I think like 70 years after, are extraordinarily prescient. So what he said is, the whole point of Europe is that it should want to exist as its own self, independently from the US. Europe is useless if it doesn't control its own defense and therefore its own policy. NATO is a subterfuge. It's a machine to disguise the stronghold of America over Europe. Thanks to NATO, Europe is placed under the dependence of the US without seeming to be. Becoming used to submitting ourselves is giving up the state and the country. It is losing our soul, because our general and colonels will get used to a command structure that's denationalized. They will themselves denationalize. They will lose the sense of the state and the nation, the respect of national hierarchy, without which there is no more army, no more states, no more nation. And what goes for the military leadership also goes for governments. If the government doesn't assume the defense of the country, if it relinquishes this responsibility to the Americans, it loses its legitimacy and thus its authority. It doesn't have the right to decide because it has renounced its duty to lead. So, worth noting that at the time when de Gaulle said these words, NATO was, of course, only purposed to defending Europe against the Soviet Union. And he will be absolutely horrified that A, not only France is back in NATO, but B, that NATO now gets expanded to fight on the other side of the world for American interests, which is crazy when you think about it. So when de Gaulle was speaking about relinquishing our responsibility to the Americans, it's a massive understatement in today's context.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I actually did not know about that quote. That's really interesting. And I mean, right now, though, I mean, it's not written in stone, right? It's not like the EU is just completely going along. You do have some EU leaders that are pushing back a little bit against these kinds of American demands. Can you talk about some of the differences in strategy between these kinds of two segments of European leaders? On the one side, I mean, they're all pretty hawkish, but on one side, you have people like Olaf Scholz, who's maybe more obviously on the American side. They're all on the American side, but maybe a little bit more hesitant to just jump right into whatever America asks for if it's going to actually hurt Germany or hurt the EU. And then you have the sort of more Atlanticist types, the more hawkish types like Ursula von der Leyen, whose name I always butcher, but oh well, who is just like completely on board with the American hostility towards China and just like ready to like sacrifice Europeans for American hegemony. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of like fracture among these two groups of people?
So yeah, I think there is a big divide in Europe between very pro-American countries like the Baltics, Poland, or even the UK, even though it's not in Europe anymore, but it's in NATO, and countries that want to maintain a healthy amount of independence, meaning not being part of any bloc, like France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal. I was listening the other day to Gérard Haro, who is the former French ambassador to the US, who described this quite well. He was saying that his worry was that a certain number of countries, which, by the way, don't have many interests or much history in Asia, tell themselves, Americans help us against Russia, we need to help them against China. And to him, they have a very simplistic reasoning, comparing Taiwan to Ukraine, when both issues couldn't be more different, and buying into the whole autocracies versus democracies narrative. He says they have a very loud voice in Europe and push the European Union and NATO to be much more hawkish against China, bandwagoning behind the US. And his worry was that in Europe, when there is a strong pressure from one side, then many European countries who don't share those views just keep quiet. And this dynamic to me is particularly dangerous. We Europeans have always been sold Europe as a force for peace, but based on the description, it's in fact a forum when the most belligerent voices win out against those seeking restraints will just keep quiet. And as far as von der Leyen, VDL is concerned, I obviously don't have any insider knowledge, but based on her public statements, she positions herself as the representative of those countries that want to fully align behind the US and China, which is quite bizarre because in her position as a representative of the whole of Europe, why choose to do that instead of representing a more nuanced position that represents the whole of Europe? Why be the voice for the most belligerent countries? And that's also very worrying to me. We essentially have a European Commission that doesn't play its role.
Yeah, and also unelected. Let me throw that in there. Very undemocratic and unelected. You know, we've watched these very dire consequences on Europe as a result of the sanctions on Russia. Europe, they're talking about energy rationing and winter is coming and they're not sure, there might be blackouts and just things that we would never have believed would be possible a year ago, happening in Europe on top of inflation, a coming recession, if it's not already here. So the consequences of trying to cut ties with Russia have already been so dire. You've actually written about that before. So I'm curious, is it even possible for Europe to cut ties with China the way the US wants Europe to without actually like destroying itself and just totally imploding? Like what would happen to Europe if it did cut ties with China?
I mean, it's really quite bad. So Joseph Borrell, who is the High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs, the garden versus jungle guy, as he is known these days, had a rare moment of lucidity, and he said something quite true. He said that China and Russia provided the basis of Europe's prosperity, this past decades. Russia with cheap energy, and China with trade, both in and out. And he even went as far as saying that Chinese workers have done much better and much more to contain inflation than all the central banks together, which is quite a statement. And he's not wrong. If you look at the consequences of the sanctions on Russia, and then keep in mind that China's economy is 10 times the size of Russia, and that when Russia was only a provider of energy, China is a provider of literally everything we buy. It's quite literally the factory of the world. So, yeah, it's just impossible to even predict how big the consequences of cutting from China will be.
There's definitely economic suicide. That much we do know.
Yeah.
And as a result of that understanding, we do see that the German and French finance ministers, also the other thing too, it's so interesting is like, while China is still trying to maintain, a mutually respectable relationship with the Europeans, and the United States is demanding cut ties with China, at the same time, US policies towards Europe are actually, if they go into effect, are going to hurt Europe. And here, of course, I'm talking about the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. So we see that the German and French finance ministers have actually expressed concerns about the Inflation Reduction Act in the US because it's basically discriminatory in its production requirements. And the Europeans are saying that this could actually cause the deindustrialization of Europe, which in some cases is already sort of taking place because of the sanctions on Russia and what that's doing to energy shortages. But what's going on here? Do you think that this points to a trend perhaps of European leaders to some degree putting their own citizens and economies before US interests? Because I was actually amazed to see that the foreign ministers even threatened to take their complaints about the Inflation Reduction Act to the World Trade Organization.
Yeah, so the Inflation Reduction Act, as far as I understand it, provides massive subsidies to US firms, which would make European firms much less competitive because they don't have those subsidies. So it's an unfair competitive advantage for US firms versus European ones, not only European ones, also, I mean, any non-American one, basically. At the time when, like you just said, European firms are already becoming much less competitive with all the energy stuff, due to Russia, because now they need to spend much more on energy, which increases their costs massively. So obviously, Europeans are not pleased about that, and surprisingly, quite vocal about it. We have another sign which I found quite interesting as well on the China export controls. But I think it was on the 7th of October, the US, basically started a kind of economic war, a new one, against China on semiconductor, basically forbidding its own firms and a lot of semiconductor firms around the world to export some tech to China or to any US person to work for Chinese firms to help China on semiconductors. And what was interesting there is that no ally, they tried during 6 to 12 months, according to some reports, to get other countries to join them in that effort, and they didn't manage to convince a single country. So they went at it alone, and their plan now is to go at it alone, and through extraterritorial legislation, try to coerce other countries around the world to follow suit. And there is also a lot of pushback against that. So Dutch officials, for instance, the Dutch are very big on semiconductors. They said they were being bullies. Japan said that this infringed on their sovereignty. So yeah, we're seeing more and more that the US is living in the world of America first, and more countries, are discovering that and are starting to tell themselves that maybe the world they thought they were living in, where everyone is friendly and nice to each other, just doesn't exist anymore. There is this interesting sentence from Hubert Védrine, who used to be the French foreign minister, that Europe is a herbivore living in a world of carnivores, which has been very true for the past few decades. Well, at some point, the EU needs to become a carnivore too if it wants to survive, and grow some teeth to defend its sovereignty and interest against American aggression.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way to put it. And then I wanted to ask you, Arnaud, last time that we spoke, we talked specifically about how Western sanctions have blown back on European countries, while the Russians and Chinese are able to withstand these measures because they're these commodities powerhouses. And I'm curious, as winter approaches, like I mentioned, and Europe is warning of this energy rationing and the possible collapse of certain industries. Do you stand by your initial assessment, or do you have anything to add now that it's several months later that we're speaking?
So I think actually this winter is not going to be too bad, because European countries managed to, right before the winter, put their reserves at full capacity. So they will have enough energy in storage to last through the winter, especially since so far the winter is quite mild. It's about 15 degrees right now here in France. So this winter isn't going to be as dire as we thought it would be, but next year will probably be a real problem, because we'll be in a situation where we won't be able to replenish the reserves because there is no more Russian energy coming, and there is no other producer that is out there with sufficient production to help replenish those reserves. So if we don't somehow restore the relationship, at least the energy relationship, or some form of energy relationship with Russia by then it will be a real problem. But in the meantime, of course, it still remains extremely damaging to European industry, in particular German industry. That's why many German firms these days are spending big time to relocate their production elsewhere, outside Europe, which is quite sad, really, to places where energy can still be relatively cheap. Funnily enough, those German firms are following Russian gas to China. So yeah, we're seeing huge German firms like the auto companies like BMW and so on and so forth, or BASF, the chemical firm, committing to spending tens of billions of dollars in China to have huge production plans there, because that's where the Russian energy is now. So it's it just shows the whole stupidity of all of this.
It's really unbelievable. But so, since you're in France right now, how is the French public feeling about Ukraine? I mean, I know you say that winter is going to be okay, but there's still all of these other problems. The fallout of the crisis is causing horrible inflation, a potential recession. People's wages have basically been cut as a result of this. So what are the attitudes of people in France? Is it still very much, no matter what, we're going to support, continuing supporting Ukraine no matter what happens. Is there any opposition to this war among either the right or left or among workers? What's going on?
To be honest, it's quite depressing in France, because when you read French media, except for a few rare exceptions, there is very little diversity of opinion. Also in the political class, really, even less than in the US, which is rather striking. Sadly, but understandably, the French in general just they don't know better. Their beliefs comes from what the media tells them, or what or the ideas that are represented by politicians. So while I think there is a bit of Ukraine fatigue, it's now quite rarely mentioned in the media. I don't meet many people who understand the geopolitical implications of it all. They just toe the party line. After, of course, the French can see that France's decline continues. They're getting poorer. Everything is getting more expensive in the supermarkets. I was very struck by that because I came back to France quite recently. I'm only staying there for a couple of months. I think compared to the last time I was in France, prices are, which was 3 years ago, prices are something like 40-50% more expensive in supermarkets, and salaries definitely didn't increase by 40-50%. So yeah, it's there is a real feeling of decline, really. But there is, as far as I can see, no one, no media, no politician that really expresses ideas that differ from what we commonly hear from the West in general, basically.
Yeah. And then just on another sort of aspect of the French situation, we recently saw that Macron, I think it was like last week, he was seen engaging, interestingly enough, with Maduro, the president of Venezuela, quite politely, which was surprising to see because he addressed him as the president. And this comes after years of France aligning itself with the U.S. policy of recognizing Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela as a part of this attempt to overthrow the government there. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. Is that about wanting to secure other avenues of energy? Because, of course, Venezuela is this huge energy producer. And do you think it means anything about, obviously Russia's completely isolated, but it seems like you can only isolate so many countries that are the world's largest energy producers if you don't produce any energy yourself, or at least not enough for your own country. So does the isolation of Russia, do you think, mean certain Western countries having better relations with the smaller countries that they've been, trying to isolate as well, countries like Venezuela?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, this shows the level of cynicism that exists in international relations, when you can say very convincingly one thing one day based on big ideas, and completely contradicting it the next day when it's when you don't think it's in your own interest anymore. So I think it's obviously about oil. I mean, Venezuela, I believe, has the world's biggest oil reserves, if I'm not mistaken, and I believe that more broadly, it's a sign that maybe there is this term that we were living in the world of liberal hegemony when it was the US and the West in general trying to remake the world in its image, and picking countries around the world that weren't liberal democracies, and doing actions against that to try and transform them into carbon copies of Western countries. I think the engagement of Venezuela and maybe other countries shows that with that ideological phase of international relations is maybe behind us, and we're moving towards a world based on realism, realpolitik, where relationship between countries is not based on values anymore, but rather based on interests, which honestly I believe is probably much saner, because when relationship between countries are based on values, it's it drives a lot of conflicts, as we've seen for the past 30 years, because that liberal hegemony world, started after the end of the Cold War, and there were studies made on this, which are incredible. There were more conflict initiated by the US in the world after the Cold War in those past 30 years than during the Cold War, which instinctively you would think would be a much more fractious period. So it was basically that ideological attempt to remake the world in our image. So yeah, I see this as a rather good sign, hopefully.
Yeah, we can only hope so. I wanted to actually get, just to a couple more questions here before we wrap up. And I wanted to ask you to comment on this article that appeared in the New York Review of Books. This is from a couple of weeks ago. It was around the time that there was the National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. And of course, for those who are only listening, it's called China, Back to Authoritarianism. And then the subheading is Xi Jinping, who is about to be granted an unprecedented third term as China's leader, has turned out to be an ambitious strongman who has remade the political system and expanded his own power. And of course, this is a kind of playbook we see about any country that has become the sort of target of U.S. Imperialism, of a U.S. desire to maintain its hegemony. And of course, China is really the biggest threat to that in recent memory, just by its sheer existence, not even because China's really doing anything to try to like challenge American hegemony. They're just trying to exist as a country that's treated in a respectful way, that has over 1 billion people and a massive economy. That said, I'm curious what your reaction is. I don't know if you got a chance to read this article, but I mean, there were so many like it, right? Is this attitude that China is becoming more authoritarian, that Xi Jinping is like this new strongman that we should fear. What are your thoughts about that kind of narrative that we see proliferating more and more in the Western media?
So you won't be surprised by me saying that I don't like the term authoritarianism, because it's I think it's very intellectually lazy and ideological. At the end of the day, China is China, and every country needs to be understood in its context and with its history. So one interesting statistic to consider is that if the US had the same ratio of population to arable land as China does, its population would be over 2 billion people. Do you think that the current American political system could satisfy the needs of 2 billion Americans when it comes to food security, housing, physical security, jobs, and so on? No, it would be a very different political system, I bet. You also need to look at the geopolitical context. The US, which is still the world's most powerful country, especially military-wise, as its key objective to contain China. It literally surrounds the country with military bases. It constantly tries to mount color revolutions in China, looking at every opportunity. Do you think that if the roles were reversed, with immensely powerful China surrounding the US with bases and doing its utmost to sow chaos in the US, do you think that in that situation the US wouldn't become much more paranoid and authoritarian than it is today? Yeah, you also, speaking about context, you should also compare China today to historical China. The Chinese people have never had it better in their entire history. Poverty has been eliminated. There are no more famines, which have been a real plague throughout China's history. Pretty much everyone has a car, decent housing. The country has the best infrastructure network in the world, the most millionaires in the world, increasingly the best education system in the world, and so on and so forth. So if you ask any Chinese person at what point in their history they would have rather been born, pretty much everyone would answer today. It's a no-brainer. So it's very easy for foreigners to go bash China and tell them how horrible their system of government is. But from their standpoint, it rings very hollow. They're like, "Are you kidding me? This is good." So of course, she now does a third term and is undeniably very powerful in China. There is also zero COVID, which is true, does start to take a real toll on the population. But to me, it's way too early to conclude that it's a step backward. Zero COVID is starting to show signs of being rolled out. As for Xi, well, let's see. He stayed in power less time than many Western leaders like Angela Merkel. And it's not like he's senile. He's 10 years younger than Biden, for instance. So I'm an optimist. I think that China has proven for decades that it knows how to make the right decisions. So it makes more sense to believe that they will continue on this momentum rather than believe in the China collapse theory.
And, Arnaud, one of the last thing I want to ask you about is the fact that, you've said in past interviews before that the West can actually learn quite a bit from China, and that you specifically as an entrepreneur feel quite free in China. So I'm curious if you could elaborate on that and maybe give us an idea, because you do live there, of what is like the idea of freedom in China versus how we perceive freedom in the West, and why is that an important distinction to understand?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because most people, when they hear China and freedom in the same sentence, they're a bit, yeah, exactly. So I think we have come to have a very specific and somewhat skewed definition of freedom in the West. What we mean by freedom is, in fact, individual freedom. The concept, that we're all born with inalienable rights as individuals, and that the primary responsibility of the state is to ensure that those rights aren't violated, which is, of course, an important concept, but left unbalanced, it leads to some downsides as well for society as a whole. So a great example is, for instance, the right to bear arms in the US. Does that make people more free when everyone around you has a gun? Or property rights, for instance. Within a few generations, individual property rights applied strictly, that leads to an extreme concentration of wealth in just a few hands and a very unequal society. Or even freedom of expression, which, as an individual is very liberating. Everyone obviously wants to express themselves freely. But as we can see in many Western societies, when left unchecked, it leads to a situation where there are so many conflicting interpretations of reality that society become incredibly divided, with different groups living in alternate realities, what we call, post-truth societies, where there is simply no common understanding of the world and widespread mistrust in government and the media, which is a real problem because trust is the glue that binds a society together. So we arrive at the somewhat paradoxical situation where unchecked individual freedom effectively erodes freedom in society overall. The best illustration of this paradox is the fact that the US, which is the country which probably has the strongest individual freedoms in the world, is also by far the country with the highest prison population in the world. They have 25% of the world's prisoners, despite only having 4% of the world's population. And a very good case can be made that it's a direct result of individual freedoms left unchecked, like the freedom to bear arms, the drug problem, which can be argued is a result of too much freedom given to youngsters to experiment with the substance, the structural poverty and inequality that results from an extreme interpretation of individual property rights, and so on and so forth. So how free are you really in a society like this, where you have extreme inequality, high crime rates, mass imprisonment, high social tension, very little trust? Is that really freedom? And China has a very different conception of freedom. In Chinese culture, again, stemming from their very long history, the paramount value in society isn't freedom, but order and harmony. Why? Because if you look at China's history, dynasty after dynasty, you always have an initial period of 100, 200 years when society becomes progressively more orderly and harmonious as the dynasty is on its rise, before it reaches a peak, and then it slowly regresses, and bit by bit it becomes more chaotic, and it often ends in terrible civil wars or war, before the cycle gets restarted. So it's understandable that Chinese people fear chaos, because to them it's a sign that society is regressing, that it's all on a downward trend. When, for instance, we look at people protesting in the streets in France, we get a lot of that as a harbinger of social progress. The Chinese look at it as a bad omen, the sign that society is becoming more chaotic. So as a result, to the Chinese, individual rights have to be balanced by some other force that ensures that harmony and order, what we could also call the common good, serves as a guide. To them, freedom means little in a society plagued by chaos. Individual rights have to be balanced with the responsibility. We all have to ensure that our collective environment is healthy and sustainable. At the end of the day, it's the Chinese concept of yin and yang. It's nothing is ever all black or all white. It's everything is always about balance and harmony. Nothing should ever take overriding importance over its opposite. Otherwise, the system as a whole becomes destabilized. So it's a very different way of seeing the world.
And I mean, you basically have chosen to live there and raise, I guess, your family there. Does that factor into your decision to be in China versus spending all your time in Europe? I'm just curious, and maybe it's a personal question, but
yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, I live there because my wife is Chinese. We met here in Europe, and then we decided to have some kids together, and we wanted to raise them as in two cultures. For them to not be pure French, not be pure Chinese, but be French Chinese, to understand both their cultures as natives. And the very basic reason why we moved to China is because there is no Chinese school in France, but there are French schools in China. So you can raise them into cultures in China, because they get a French education in the French school, and then they learn Chinese culture by being in China. All their neighbors are Chinese, they're just in China. Whereas the contrary is not possible when you're raised in France, and we're seeing that with friends who also have a French Chinese couple. The kids often end up being really much more French than they are Chinese. Right. They're not. They don't have those two cultures. So that was a very, basic decision.
Well, Arnaud, I want to thank you for taking the time to come on and speak with me again. This was really a wonderful conversation. Can you let everybody who's watching know where they can follow you? You're quite a prolific tweeter.
Yeah. If you ask my wife, that's not really a good thing. So my Twitter handle is at Arnaud Bertrand, RNAUDBERTRAND. So, but you just Google Arnaud Bertrand, my name, Twitter. You can find me. It's quite easy.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. This was really great.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching, everyone. If you want to see more progressive anti-imperialist content like this, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can stay up to date with the latest breakthrough news content. And if you want to support our work and get access to exclusive content, head over to patreon.com/breakthroughnews.